Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to have you all here. My name is Georg Karle. It's 13 years ago that I was standing at the same place to introduce famous speaker Richard Stallman, who now again has the honor to visit us. Where 13 years ago we were much smaller as a university. We had ambitions, we advanced. Some people got older. I got less hair, Richard as well. I don't wait to take more time for the introduction. Richard, please start your talk.
Could someone please help by plugging this in?
I do so. Now electricity is there.
So, I'm going to start the presentation by showing a 14-minute video which explains the basic ideas of the free software movement, most of them, more compactly than I can do it without the video. I practiced how to say that, the script that I'd written for that video to make it fit. So please start the video. Free software is the first battle in the liberation of cyberspace. Who controls your computer? Is it you? Or is it some big company that's really controlling it? Well, what is a computer? A computer is a universal machine. It will do any computation you want it to because you give it a program that says what the computation is that you want. So the computer only knows how to get out an instruction and do it, and get out another instruction and do it. The program has the instructions. It says what to do. So by writing the right program, you can make it do anything. Well, almost anything. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's obeying your instructions when really it's obeying somebody else first, and you, only as much as that company wants it to, will let it listen to you. With software, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program or the program controls the users. It's inevitably one or the other. So in order for the users to control the program, they need the four essential freedoms. And that's the definition of free software. Free software respects the user's freedom and community. Now, we often call it Libre, using the French or Spanish word, pronounce it as you like. The point is, that's what we mean. We don't mean it's gratis. We're not talking about price. We're concerned with your freedom. And we sometimes say free/Libre to show that. So, freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for whatever purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so it does the computing you want it to do. But what is the source code? Well, every program typically will have two forms. There's the form that you can read and you can understand if you know the programming language. That's the source. That's what programmers write and change. Then there's the executable, which is a bunch of numbers which even a programmer can't figure out. If all you get is the executable, it's a horrible pain in the neck to figure out what it does, and even harder to change it. So, to give you the real possibility to study and change it, they've got to give you the source code. That's a requirement. Well, with those two freedoms, each user separately can make a copy and start changing it and make it do what she wants. That's individual control. But what if you're not a programmer? You look at the source code and you don't understand it. Individual control isn't enough. We also need collective control, which means any group of users are free to work together to adapt the program to what they want. Of course, in the group, some of them are programmers. They're the ones who actually write the changes, but they're doing it as part of the group for what the group wants. Of course, the group doesn't have to be everybody. So others can use it some other way. They're all free to do that. So Collective control requires two more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies, to make the copies and then give them away or sell them when you wish. And freedom 3 is similar, but it's for your modified versions. You're free to make copies and then give them or sell them when you wish. So if you do have these freedoms, then it's free software. The users control the program. But if any of those freedoms is missing, then the users don't control the program. Instead, the program controls the users, and the developer controls the program. So that means this program is an instrument of unjust power for its developer over the users. That means the users don't have freedom. That's non-free proprietary software, which we got to get rid of. Well, when you've got proprietary software, what happens? Sometimes the program snoops on the user. Sometimes it tracks the user. Sometimes it restricts the user and stops users from doing what they want to do. You can see that the blue ray is your enemy. Sometimes the software remotely deletes books, as Amazon did with 1984. Sometimes the developer compels users to install a harmful upgrade by threatening to take away other functionality if it's not installed, as Sony did. And sometimes they can even forcibly change the software at a distance, as Microsoft can with Windows through the universal backdoor. So sometimes they even sabotage users, as Microsoft does when it tells the NSA about bugs in Windows so it can use them to attack people's computers. Well, what you get is basically, with proprietary software, the owner has power over the users and takes advantage of this power, putting in those various malicious functionalities to hurt the users. Of course, they don't do this because they're sadists. They're doing it just for money, for greed. They have various ways that they can profit from having this power over users, which does not make it even the tiniest bit less evil. But they have no shame about it. They have conferences where they talk about the latest ways they can take advantage of users through the power they have. Basically, proprietary software, which is now from almost all the users of proprietary software, they're using proprietary malware. It's software for suckers. So how do you stop being the victim? Formerly, you had to stop using computers, but not anymore. Now you can come join us in the free world that we've built. In 1983, I announced I would develop a completely free software operating system called GNU. In 1992, we had it almost finished, but one piece was missing, the kernel. Linus Torvalds in that year freed his kernel Linux, which filled the last gap and gave us the first complete system you could run on a PC, GNU plus Linux. So, unfortunately, having freedom at one point doesn't guarantee you'll keep it. There are over 1,000 different variants of GNU/Linux. They're called distributions. A few of them are entirely free software. Most of them have non-free software added because they're maintained by people who aren't concerned about freedom. They'd rather add convenience at the cost of freedom. So you have to check which is a free distro. To keep your freedom sometimes requires a sacrifice, sometimes a big sacrifice, as at Lexington. Sometimes, but in our campaign, they tend to be little sacrifices. Anybody with a little bit of maturity can make these sacrifices. For instance, you want applications, but some of them are non-free. If you want freedom, you got to do without them. So there may be some inconveniences you have to suffer for your freedom's sake. Then many websites send non-free programs written in JavaScript to the user's browser. If you don't want to run non-free programs, you should install Libre.js, which keeps out non-free JavaScript. And sometimes servers will offer to do your computing. They say, send us all your data, obviously for suckers. Then the server does the computing and sends you back the results. but you're not supposed to think about what's happening because it's a cloud and you don't see what's going on. Well, you should look. It's service as a software substitute, and it takes away control of your computing. So a large fraction of the world's web servers are running gnu/linux and other free software. But I think the most important computers to put freedom in are your computers, not companies' web servers. They deserve freedom also. But above all, it's people that deserve freedom. So we need to advance. And to do that, we have to cross obstacles. One of them is there are big companies that make a lot of money by having control over users, and they don't want to let us advance. We have to overcome their opposition. Another is that the mainstream media don't talk about free software. They have a term that they use to bury these ethical issues. They say open source instead. Now, it talks about more or less the same programs, but with different ideas, where free software activists say, this is a matter of right and wrong. Users deserve freedom. We demand freedom. The people who say open source, they don't want to say that. So instead they say, let the users change the software and redistribute it, and they'll make the code better. They'll fix some bugs. It may be true, but it's a less important issue. If we want to keep our freedom, we've got to talk about freedom. So say free software, and you're helping us every time. Another obstacle is that lots of schools teach non-free software, which is basically like teaching the kids to smoke tobacco. It's implanting dependence, which is the opposite of what schools should do. A school should prepare citizens to live in a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society, which means teaching free software in the school. But there's another reason to do that for education. Some kids want to become programmers. They're curious. They want to know how the programs work. Well, the one who's studying a free software can understand it. The one who's studying a non-free program can't learn anything because the knowledge in the non-free program is withheld, denied to the students. So to uphold the spirit of education, the school should make sure its programs are free. But there's an even more important reason. Schools should teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping other people. So the class should say, if you bring a program to class, just as if you bring cookies to class, you've got to share it with everyone else. Can't keep it to yourself. You've got to share the source code so other people can learn. So don't bring any proprietary software to this class. The school has to set a good example by following its own rule. It should bring only free software to class, except as a reverse engineering exercise. Another obstacle is there's hardware we don't know how to write free software for because they won't tell us how to use the hardware. That's shocking. They want to sell you the product and they won't tell you how to use it. They say, here's a non-free program you can use, run it and shut up. Don't bother us. Well, how do we find out how to run that hardware? With reverse engineering. You've got to study all those zeros and ones to figure out what they really do and write down how to use that hardware so someone else can write the free program to do it. It's hard work, but it can be done. If you want to make a big technical contribution, that's what you should do. Each new activity of life can bring with it new human rights that are necessary. And the human rights depend on each other. If you lose one, it becomes harder to maintain the others. So nowadays, computing is so important in society that the freedoms of free software are among the human rights that society must establish and protect. Thus, how to help? Well, you can write free software. You can organize groups to campaign and persuade schools and governments to move to free software. You can help other people when they have trouble using free software or help them install it. You can say free software and spread the philosophical ideas. Moving to free software is the first step in the liberation of cyberspace. But of course, we also use the internet. We need other freedoms there, like network neutrality and putting an end to surveillance of people in general.
Well, that's the beginning of things. One thing that's not covered in the video is copyleft. You've probably heard about it. It's an idea for how to make a program free software, but require, so everyone is free to make and release modified versions, but with copyleft, those modified versions are required to be free software also. This is important because I had seen, even at the beginning, I had seen examples where one person released an important free program and somebody else made modifications that were important to us, but the modified version was non-free. So that's basically asking to lose if you let people do that. So I invented a way of using copyright law to bar that conduct. It's a copyright-based license which states the freedoms that the user has, but also conditions. And the conditions are basically that when you redistribute it, you must give the other people the same freedoms. You can't pass along the code and peel off the freedom, making it a non-free program. You must let those who come after you have the same freedom that you got from the authors. I implemented copyleft in the gnu+linux general public license because at that time gnu+linux was the one program in the GNU system that was worth releasing. And eventually, after we had several programs released, I realized it was important to write the license so you could drop it into any program, and that program would be governed by the license. So in 1989, I released the first GNU General Public License, which was the license for any program that said the GNU General Public License is the license for this program. And the place you say that is at the beginning of every source file, where the copyright notice normally is. And it should have a copyright notice. I'm sad to say that the Berne Convention has done terrible harm to the world by causing everything anyone writes to be copyrighted. But still, despite that, it's important to put on a copyright notice on your work, followed by a license notice, which says there you can find the description of the freedom and the rules for operating with those freedoms and respecting those freedoms for other users of the program. So that's the right way to do it. Now, it was clear to me that this license would need to be changed sometimes. So I had to invent a license upgrade path, a way that we could release a new version of the license and give the users of the already released programs the option of operating under the newer license version. They can if it says GPL version 2 or later, then they can always use that program under GPL version 2. But now that there's a version 3, they also have the option of using it under version 3. And if there's ever a version 4, they will all get the option of using that program under GPL version 4. We needed to have a license upgrade option because we can't anticipate the future. Things will happen that will call for changes in the license, and they can't be made retroactively, but we have to be able to give people the new option. The simplest example has to do with BitTorrent. In 1991, I released version 2 of the GNU GPL, and it said that if you distribute compiled binaries of a program, you must provide the corresponding source code in one of the suitable ways. Because it's wrong to distribute a binary without its corresponding source code. That would make it non-free. And the whole point of the GPL is you can't make it non-free. You have to distribute it respecting freedom for others. Well, that was fine, except with BitTorrent. Anybody who downloads the torrent, let's suppose the torrent contains binaries of GPL-covered programs. It might be a gnu+linux distribution full of binaries, and the source code's not there. So somebody starts the torrent and is distributing the binaries, and to follow the rules says, by the way, you can find the source code over there. That makes it ethical. If you want to download those sources, you can do that. But somebody who wants to download the torrent of binaries automatically, without knowing it, is distributing those same binaries. And so that requirement to GPL version 2 applies to people who think they're just fetching the binaries. That's obviously not right. So in GPL version 3, I rewrote this condition so that it doesn't it doesn't require anything for that case. It's the people who start the torrent who have the responsibility to offer source code, not the people who download it and redistribute the binaries without knowing it. Well, that's the best thing we can do, is adapt the license when the world changes. So that's one reason why at the top of a source file you should say, this program can be redistributed under GPL version 3 or any later version. Now, there is a point I should mention. You'll hear a lot of marketing hype about so-called artificial intelligence. And there are programs for which I think that term is appropriate. They can do a good job in some very narrow area, as well as a human can do in many cases. For instance, there's a program that can look at a picture of an insect and tell you whether that is an Asian hornet that kills lots of honeybees. And that's a very dangerous, intrusive pest. We've got to wipe that out in any place it's entering. So an automatic, quick way to recognize them is a big help. And it can recognize them as well as a human being. Well, I'd say anything that involves some kind of thinking and can do it as well as a human can do it qualifies as intelligence, even though it's rather narrow. But one thing that is not artificial intelligence is a chatbot, or more generally, the large language models that chatbots are built on. They are really artificial, can't argue with that, but they are not intelligence, because intelligence is the ability to know or understand things, at least in a particular domain. And they don't know anything, they can't understand anything. They generate text which sounds real enough that you would think that it understands and knows, until you see it slip up and you realize it never knows anything. It can't understand anything. But calling it artificial intelligence is a way of duping lots of people into believing what these things output, which you should never do, and into using them, which is you're trying to either fool yourself or fool others. I never use them. And I urge you to reject them too. But the other, of course, reason, of course, is that they're not free software. And therefore, they take away your freedom. So we can resist the pressure on people to embrace this brilliant artificial intelligence by refusing to use that term. I call them bullshit generators because that accurately fits them. Philosophically, the definition of bullshit is utterances formulated with indifference to the truth. Now, a person is capable of paying attention to the truth, but might choose not to and produce bullshit instead. But these things, they're not able to pay attention to the truth. Anything that can't understand truth will always be indifferent to truth. Bullshit is the best they can do. So if we call them bullshit generators, the hype will start to fail. And we will find it easier to resist pressure placed on people to use them. But you'll notice one kind of malicious functionality now being introduced into lots of non-free programs and into various online disservices is that whether you like it or not, they will push on you the output of a bullshit generator. And companies that talk with you will insist, they will route your complaints to a bullshit generator that will send you a response which often doesn't understand the problem at all. This happened to me when I had a really bad experience missing a flight from Newark Airport to Berlin. I was there, the flight eventually was canceled, and by then I didn't know where I would stay in the area, and I had no way to find out how I had been rebooked. They told us to find out how you've been rebooked, either scan this QR code or visit this website. And I couldn't do either one. I couldn't connect to the internet at the airport because I won't connect to a network that collects my identity for a company or makes me run non-free software, and most public Wi-Fi in places like airports does those things. And I had nothing that could scan a QR code, and I know that I can't use an airline's website anyway because it sends lots of non-free software to run in your browser, and I won't let that run, so the website doesn't work for me. I told the staff, and they wouldn't tell me any way I could find out what flight I had been put on. What was I going to do? I had to wait an hour or so for my suitcase to come back out and then try to find a way to get back to Manhattan because it was too late for the trains to be running. And I went to the friend's house where I'd been staying, and fortunately I could get the keys again. So I had a place to send mail to the people who had invited me and bought the ticket. And I knew they would fix the problem and tell me in the morning. So things went okay. But that was luck. It's terrible treatment of customers. And I suppose it could happen again. Well, if it happened from Boston, I'd just go home. I couldn't do that at Newark Airport. But you see and then when I complained by email, I got a response that was obviously written by a bullshit generator. There was no way I could reach a human being. So, basically, today's computing is ever more designed to subjugate the public. They make you run non-free software even in your own computer or talk to a server in which everything is done supposedly for you, but by software that the users can't control, so it's not really going to be working with your interests at heart. The only way you can do computing that will be designed to work in the interests of the users is if you're running free software yourself, your copy, on a computer you control. If you're talking to a server, then the server is someone else's server. Then that someone may have installed free programs. I hope so. Someone deserves freedom also. I hope that someone is using free software. But if it's per copy of a free program and you have no control over it and it's doing your computing, well, that's not just either, because you deserve control over how your computing gets done. And you can't have it with someone else's copy running in someone else's computer. The only way to have control of your computing is don't do it that way. So if somebody says, I have a text editor you can use on my computer, and you can store the work here, and you can edit it over the network and collaborate with other people, but the software that's doing that is not under your control, or you or any of your collaborators. You all have equally little control over how that program works. That is not a freedom-respecting way for the editing to be done. This we call service as a software substitute. It's not a very convenient and cute name. I'd like to find a better name. But the point is, even if that looks like an exciting way to do software, it's the wrong way. So, in effect, these companies are following a practice of divide the public and subjugate each one. And this is why it's so important to refuse those convenient offers. Because if the convenient offer makes you a prisoner of some company, it's not going to stay convenient. And this process is known as enshittification. Because one of the fundamental causes of enshittification is non-free software. It makes it, whoever controls the non-free program has an automatic opportunity to mistreat the users who have been trapped. So for instance, Adobe used to sell non-free programs. That was an injustice. Every non-free program is an injustice. But then Adobe realized that it had the users hooked, and so it imposed incompatibility. It made the Adobe software use only its incompatible formats and did not implement exporting in another format that would be good as the real source of whatever you're working on. So that was secret. There was no way for a competitor to make similar tools that users could easily switch to. And obviously, if you believe in competition as a way to make business work for the good of their customers, you shouldn't allow that kind of lock-in. It ought to be illegal. But it isn't. And then, once users were locked in this way, Adobe said, we're going to spy on your work. So your work is going to be uploaded automatically to our server. They call it, quote, the cloud, unquote, because they don't want people to think about who server it is and who controls it and what that someone could do with it. So that added an additional level of injustice to the Adobe software. If you're thinking about the long-term future of your life, you see that that software is designed to be evil, and you should reject it now. If some of your work is trapped, well, don't let any more work of your work get to be trapped. Now, the term open source, which I never use except to oppose, to say that's not what I stand for, was coined by people who didn't agree with the free software movement. Some of them developed free software, and that's a good thing to do. Whatever your political ideas are, developing and contributing to free software is contributing to a free society. But their political ideas did not lead them to support and promote freedom as an idea. Nearly all open source programs are free. Nearly all free programs are open source. In each direction, there are exceptions. And if you want to learn about that, look at gnu.org/philosophy/open source misses the point.html. And in particular, it gives examples of both kinds of difference. But the main difference is a matter of values. The free software movement is based on valuing freedom and defending freedom for ourselves and for others. Open source completely rejects that idea. And this is why I don't ever promote open source. I will state my appreciation for developers of free programs who call them open source, but I will not endorse their philosophy. I want to teach people the importance of freedom, and I hope you'll join me in supporting that too. So, you might wonder, what are legitimate uses of servers? Well, there are. You shouldn't use someone else's server to do your own computing. What does your own computing mean? Well, it means that in principle, if you had the right software, you could do it in your own computer. It doesn't involve communicating with others. And those things you should do in your own computer or not at all. But, of course, there are activities which are primarily communication. For instance, you want to buy something from a store. Well, clearly, that has to involve your computer and the store's computer. So it involves and a network for them to talk to each other. That's the nature of commerce. You're doing commerce with others, and all the participants have to talk with each other. So that's a perfectly acceptable use of servers. In addition, publishing something, putting a page on your website so people get to see it, that's perfectly normal. And that's a proper use of a server. And there are many other examples you can work out. What shouldn't be done with servers is to invite people to depend on someone else's server for their own activities that should be under their full control. So this leads us to the conclusion that the idea of a web app is a bad one, because that implies that you're going to visit a website not simply to see what someone else wants to say to you and to the public, but rather it will be doing computing for you. If what they want to do is like that, they should release free software to do that computing so that you can run that on your own computer and at the same time have control over it. Of course, releasing it as free software would also enable you to change it and release your modified version. And people might like your version or not. They might trust you or not. It's up to them to judge these things. But it wouldn't be imposed on them. When someone presents an example or educational software and sets it up as a web app, that's a way of not releasing that program at all. And then it's not really a contribution to society. The web app may still be illuminating or convenient or whatever, but it doesn't respect people's freedom. That's the wrong way to contribute anything to society. Now, people often talk about security in regard to computing, but proprietary software developers have a distorted idea of what security means. Computing security should mean that you are secure in having control over your computer and what it does. Part of that is that those programs must be free software. You can't really trust a non-free program on your computer because it might be designed to act against your interests, and the users can't even tell. They can't study what that program really does. But in the proprietary software world, you'll find implicitly a different idea of security, which is making the developer's control over the program secure so that you can't break that control over your own computer. This is a perverse idea of security. So whose security is it? Is it your security, you the user, or is it the developer's security of maintaining full power over you? If you look carefully at discussions of security from people who are not free software supporters, you'll typically find that they mean the latter. But you have to think about it to see that that's so. Now, this leads to horrible things like forcing users to identify themselves. No privacy in the world, not even in your own computer if it's running non-free software. Windows 11 requires users starting up their own computer to identify themselves to Microsoft. They are required to make Microsoft server accounts, which means Microsoft can spy on them without limit. There may be ways to avoid this, like maybe you can start it up with no internet connection. Maybe you'll be able to log in on it again later with an internet connection. I don't know. I don't use Windows, except the sort that this room doesn't have. You know, sometimes there is a use for Windows to get more ventilation, but Microsoft Windows never. But you have to realize that this is not just a bunch of individual cases of nasty behavior. Non-free software systematically invites companies to abuse the power that they have, because power corrupts. Nowadays, modern computers have malicious processors. Intel processors contain the Intel Management Engine, and since around 2010, there's no way to switch it off. The management engine is essentially a separate computer, well, logically separate computer, but it's built into the same chips. It's a processor that only runs code signed by Intel. Users are unable to write any software to run in it. And in the more recent CPU models, you can't shut it off except after boot has completed. So what is it doing while the main processor is booting? Is it installing an advanced persistent threat? Clearly, it is not security for the user. It's security for Intel and power for Intel. Of course, our freedom is threatened by laws and new changes even now. The European Union is considering a proposal called chat control, where basically they want to require all encryption software to send someone the plain text so that governments can snoop on everything anyone says to anyone else. This is absolute tyranny. I mean, I haven't heard the US propose a thing like this. So it's up to you to campaign against this and demand that encryption be allowed, end-to-end encryption. However, you can't trust the non-free programs that the products actually come with. You can't trust a non-free program to do encryption or decryption because it might have a backdoor like this. Even if there's no law saying it has to, it might be there. And especially encryption and decryption algorithms, the experts say you can't trust the algorithm if the code isn't free. You need to have the algorithm studied by looking at the code, looking for flaws, because even if nobody was malicious, there can be flaws in the algorithm. The algorithm has to be studied by real experts for a long time before it is trustworthy. Otherwise, even if it has no nasty things, it might have a flaw, a weakness. Of course, if your computer lets you run free software, you could install a free encryption program, and that way you might have trustworthy private communication. But the things like WhatsApp and Apple messaging, those are non-free software, so you wouldn't know if there's a backdoor in those. And you shouldn't trust them even if there's no chat control law. Google, it's well known that originally a large part of Android was free software. And that made it possible for people to develop a free version of Android called Replicant. Replicant hasn't been really supported on new phones because there wasn't enough energy to do the reverse engineering to write drivers for the newer peripherals. And it was 10 years ago or so, and people came up with some peripherals for some phones, but for newer phones it just wouldn't run. The Free Software Foundation now has a project to develop the free drivers based on reverse engineering. So we hope to make it possible for Replicant to fly again. There are other versions of Android that people do use, and they're mostly free software, but not at that level of device drivers. So they're not entirely free software like Lineage OS and Graphene. They're mostly free software, but there are non-free programs in them. Maybe with success in our Libre phone project, it'll be possible to fix that. But meanwhile, Google is attacking the possibility of maintaining free or mostly free versions of Android. And I don't know where that will end. And one of the nasty things in the latest Google Android is that, from what I've read, I've never seen this, it constantly pushes you to accept advice from a bullshit generator. So I would guess that this university demands that you run some non-free software. Probably some communication software, maybe Zoom or Google Meet or Microsoft Teams. I would refuse on moral grounds to run any of those. But I'm told that it may be possible for somebody, if somebody is willing to run both that and a free program like Galen for video conferencing, to gateway them to each other through sharing the screen. That might be a way of making it possible for some students to participate in the same conversation without running the non-free program. Give it a try. And if you can start organizing to help students participate in their classes without running that unjust software, you will do a great thing to promote free software in your own lives. And you might be able to explain precisely how you're doing it, and then it could be an example for everyone else. And help convince the school to stop requiring the use of unjust software. There are a lot of programs designed specifically for schools. For instance, there is test proctoring software. I like to call that procto software after a Greek word that means anus. But in any case, if I were going to a school that demanded I install that software on my own computer, and by the way, it only runs on Windows, I would say, on moral grounds, I will never install such software on my computer. But how about if you set up your computer, the school's computer, with whatever software you like, and for 3 hours, I will go into the room with that computer. You can check what else I'm carrying to make sure I'm not cheating. And I'll just sit at that computer and I'll do the exam. And then I'll never see that computer again. If all I'm doing is answering an exam, it doesn't matter to me much what software the school is running, because I wouldn't be running that software. I'd just be talking to the school's exam kiosk. And the school would suffer from the use of non-free software, but it wouldn't attack my freedom. And this is something that you should be able to do. Governments are victims of non-free software also, and they also victimize the public. In 2020, or in 2021, I had a flight connection to make in London. And I was told to fill out a form that had to do with trying to control COVID. Well, I'm very strongly in favor of trying to control COVID, as you can see. I didn't want to catch it. And I was surprised to discover that I could fill out that form with my own browser set to reject non-free JavaScript. It didn't require any. That was exemplary. Nowadays, Britain has a different website that people who are allowed to visit in principle have to fill out in order to get permission for a visit. So it was probably inspired by the ESTA program of the United States. You don't need to get a visa, but you need to do something more or less equivalent. And I couldn't possibly do that because it sent non-free software. I had to beg the person who had invited me. A few months ago, I went to England and gave talks. And I had to beg the person who had set up my visit to fill that out for me because there was no way I'd ever be able to do it. Governments, when they set up websites that people are required to use, should make sure those sites function without the users running any non-free software. Now, if it's a website, some users will use non-free browsers, but that wouldn't be the government's fault. That would be their own failure to choose freedom, but it's okay if that works. If using the site with a non-free browser works. The point is they shouldn't design the site to impose nasty requirements on the user. It should, if the user's running a free browser, as I do, and not running non-free JavaScript, as I refuse to do, the site should work. And this is a moral responsibility of every level of government. About a year ago, I was called for jury duty. And they suggested to respond through a website. And I tried running it. It wouldn't work. It sent non-free JavaScript. Well, fortunately, I could respond using other media. Ultimately, I did not quite get selected for the jury. Would have been an interesting experience. I've never actually been on a jury. But I couldn't respond through their website. They should have set up their website so that it didn't make that gratuitous, unjust requirement. Every website of any level of government should be designed so it doesn't try to make users run unjust software. And it wouldn't surprise me if that universities set up websites that require non-free software. There are a lot of MIT administrative websites that require people to run non-free software. And I couldn't use them. They just wouldn't work. It was a gratuitous requirement that they should never have made. And mostly, organizations make this requirement because they're not paying attention. An organization wants a website, and they're not in the computing field. They know nothing about any of these issues. And they go to a company that makes websites, which says, oh, we'll make one that looks nice and modern. See, it'll be like this. The question of whether there's non-free software that the user has to run is never discussed. The company sees nothing wrong in it, and the organization doesn't know it's an issue. So they get a website that says, run non-free software, or this just won't work. And most people confronting that decide to give in. This is why it's so important to make this a principle that you won't deviate from. When I encounter a website that tries to run non-free software on my computer, I don't have to ask myself, will I compromise my freedom today for this? Because if you look at the question like that, it'll almost always appear that it's worth it for you to compromise your freedom just now for this. But then doing it once might lead to doing it every week for the rest of your life. Why would you ever say no? What would it have to do to get you to ever say no? It's basically a recipe for surrendering your rights. So I never ask myself that question. If a website demands I run non-free software, I will try to work around that without running the non-free software. And if that doesn't work, then I can't use that website. Maybe it just means I can't see that. Maybe I can find somebody who will fetch it for me and send it to me. Of course, I don't ask people who I know care about this issue. If someone cares about this issue, I encourage her to keep caring and insist on that principle. But I have friends who won't listen to me about that. And they just run non-free JavaScript and they don't care. So those people I can ask to fetch something for me. So it's a big battle for freedom. Computing gets into everything. There are so-called smart products for your home that might be listening all the time and ratting on you or your neighbors. It's horrible. Amazon sells cameras that are meant to be put up looking at the street. And they've just set up a deal where police forces can request the photos. Basically, this is Orwellian spying on everyone. It should be illegal. In fact, I suggest it should be illegal to set up those cameras to watch the street. Now, if they watch your front porch, that's okay. That's your business. It's not going to affect anyone who doesn't try to come up to your door. But it shouldn't be allowed to watch the street, because that's snooping on everyone. So, at this point, it's time for questions. And are the pieces of paper ready to hand out? What? Did you say something? Yeah, okay, those are very big pieces of paper, but they'll still do. In any case, the point is you should all get some pieces of paper. Can you help distribute them so that we can get them to people? Because the next thing to do, someone has written a question already. I do it this way because it's much more efficient. I can answer a lot more questions in the available time by doing it this way. And I can read better than I can hear. Do you think there's a way to use free/Libre web search engine? The question is, will somebody set up a free Libre search engine? Except the search engine is not a program. It's a service. But it's the kind of service that makes sense to be a service. After all, it's not doing your computing, it's searching the web, searching through other people's publications. That's part of what the job is, to be looking at others' websites in a way that's more efficient than trying to have your computer visit the millions of websites when you have a question. So it's legitimate to use a server for that. And a lot of the software in that will be unreleased. Someone will write them in order to set up a search engine. It's okay to run unreleased software yourself if you're doing to implement the service you're offering. The thing is that Google search sends non-free JavaScript to your browser and tries to make you run it, and I won't do that, so I can't use Google search, which is just as well. I've heard that Google search now replaces the actual data that you were looking for with summaries generated by a bullshit generator, which you can't rely on. I don't get to see them. The administration of Munich was recently pressured through political and business interests to switch back to Microsoft software after using free software for a decade. Actually, what I heard was many, many years ago, I heard that Munich had switched back to Microsoft. It was in the 2000s that Munich had switched to gnu+linux, although they didn't give us credit in that way. And I was glad, although they were going to run a non-free distribution. One thing, please add the new ones at the bottom. It's fairer that way. Thank you. And then I heard a few years later that Microsoft had essentially bribed the government to switch back to Windows. And note, it's a crime to bribe politicians, but it's not a crime to bribe the government. If they pay the city to switch to Windows, that's lawful. And that's effectively what they did. They made a deal where they would start some sort of research center in Munich and spend millions of euros, I think, every year. And so in effect, they paid Munich to give up its own computational sovereignty. Well, it may not be a crime, but it's a dereliction of duty. It's the responsibility of the officials that run the government to maintain their sovereignty and not surrender it to any company whatsoever. Of course, if it's a foreign company, that's worse. But even if it's a domestic company, it's still wrong. It's still loss of freedom. No company should have power over the government. The government should be powerful enough that, if necessary, it can defend itself from companies that are trying to grab power. So I'm actually surprised to read that this change back to Windows was recent. Isn't asking someone to use non-free software something as well?
That's my question. Can I read?
Okay. Well, I think I understand the question.
Isn't it immoral as well to ask someone to use free software to fetch information for you?
If it's a person who has already said that he doesn't care and who uses non-free software all the time, then I think it's not. It's a way of making it, of helping oneself to defy the pressure. If I were doing that in a way that pressured a person who was thinking of rejecting non-free software, then it would be wrong. And so I take care not to ask those people. If someone is starting to care about the issue, I encourage per to reject the non-free software, and I never ask per to run non-free software that person wouldn't normally run just to do a favor for me. So I think you're partly right. Yeah?
Can I ask another question? Because I was thinking when you were saying calls, for example, right?
Proxy what?
Proxy Zoom calls. So use Zoom without actually using the Zoom software.
Well, the other people say they decide to run Zoom.
Yes.
And if you won't run Zoom, and you find one of them who's willing to connect it to another a free video conferencing program, you're not asking anyone to do something bad that person isn't already doing.
But aren't you then supporting? Are you then
No,
still supporting Zoom?
no. In these cases, the school is supporting Zoom, and will support it no matter what you do. And so how can you avoid being pressured to support Zoom as well? Well, this is one way.
Are you then not supporting the school?
No, not at all. Each student who surrenders to this pressure is supporting it a little bit. But you've got to realize that in a situation where there is a network effect, the network effect is the more people there are using a certain communications medium, the more pressure there is on everyone else to use it. The people who surrender to the pressure, I analyze as victim co-perpetrators. In the first place, you're a victim. You surrender to this pressure to do something that's bad for you and bad for others. But then, because you're using it, you're pressuring others to use it. However, if you look at this gatewaying scenario, you're not pressuring anyone else to use Zoom. Anyone else who rejects Zoom can join you in the Galen part of the video conference. So you're helping to shield other people from this pressure. And anyone you can convince to care about the issue, you're helping. And the people who won't care, well, they'll do the same thing they would do if you weren't doing anything. If you were to actually run Zoom, then you would be contributing to this pressure. You'd be a victim co-perpetrator. But these are interesting questions. Thank you. I feel that in many situations, being able to refuse proprietary software is a privilege. If a teacher makes using Procto software a requirement, can I afford to refuse? Well, indeed, it may be a sacrifice, but I presented an idea for how you could, a compromise you can suggest by which the school gets to use the software it wants, but it's not running in your computer and you're not running it. You're just talking to a kiosk. So, of course, I understand that just saying I won't take the exam this way might get you in trouble. Now, of course, they can give you the same exam where you answer on paper. I think they ought to be willing to do that. It's not as if it would be really much harder for them. But this is another kind of compromise that preserves your freedom, but gives the school what it maybe wants. People who can't afford to buy proper hardware, should they sacrifice more than other people? That's a distorting question. Basically, when you have an empire that's trying to conquer people and you say resist, it's a fact that the injustice of this will fall unequally on various people. But if you let the inequality distract you from the real injustice, which is the empire that's trying to force people, and you use that as a reason to say, okay, everybody, just yield, surrender to the empire, then we'll all suffer the same. That's foolish. That's just a recipe for surrender. Could free hardware be made by not only making free boards, but also free chips by giving your designs to a chip producer? In principle, yes. But mass producing chips is an expensive thing, and I'm told that the chip manufacturers have secrets in their processes, and they make you run non-free software to produce the design that they can fabricate, which is a horrible mess. But the crucial first thing that we really need is to have somebody mass producing chips that don't have backdoors and whose functionality is documented so we can write software to use it. In the far future, I guess we may be able to fabricate chips for ourselves, and then free chip designs will be important because it would become an issue much like software. Take a look at gnu.org/philosophy/free hardware designs.html. Does control over your computer give you digital sovereignty, and what need societies and their politicians need to do to make societies sovereign? Now, I don't use the term sovereignty to refer to an individual's control over her own computer. We all deserve that. But I don't use the word sovereignty to refer to the rights of an individual. That has to do with the power of the state to have control over the things that a state can legitimately decide, rather than have those dictated by businesses or other countries. That's what sovereignty means to me, and I think that's the traditional meaning of the word. Now, non-free software subjugates any user, including governments. If the state uses non-free software, the developer of that program has power over the state. And we should fight to prevent that. Governments should fight to prevent that. In gnu.org/government, I wrote down proposals for policies that a state can adopt to migrate away from non-free software to free software and make sure to stay sovereign in the digital domain. Now, there are things that states shouldn't control because individuals should control them in their own lives. But there are some things that states should control. For instance, the state should never use non-free software because non-free software will subjugate a state that uses it just as it subjugates individuals or organizations that use it. So this is what digital sovereignty means to me, that the government of a country or region or city should make sure it doesn't fall under the power of software developing companies. Do you think there is a way to use free Libre? Oh, that somehow got there again. Wait. Are these the ones I've just... Okay, then, okay, so I'll continue that way. Quote, AI, unquote, companies are using data, including source code, with blatant disregard of their license. I don't think so. That's not true. Looking at something and thinking about it has traditionally been everyone's right. It doesn't involve copying it. Studying the style in which something is written, studying how writing is done. We all learn how to write by reading and analyzing what we read. And that has generally not been restricted even by copyright law. And it should never be restricted by copyright law. If it is restricted, then we won't be allowed to implement our own software to understand or generate writing. And so changing copyright law to forbid analyzing the style and wording of other people's writing would be a disaster, and it would give big companies additional monopoly power. And you're seeing, I'm sure, just as I am, a campaign being waged to do this. And who would gain from that campaign? You will find writers saying that their rights have been violated. That's not what's going on with copyright. Copyright was not supposed to exist because writers are so wonderful that they inherently deserve power over the rest of us. And in fact, I think it's wrong to stop other people from sharing writings. But when it comes to learning about how to write by reading, that power would be a catastrophe for society, and we should reject that campaign entirely. This is not the first time I've seen campaigns to make copyright law more restrictive. They do that because basically the big quasi-monopolistic companies that control publication would like more power, and they can get famous people to say that it's a matter of the power they deserve over us. I think copyright law needs to be made less restrictive, not more restrictive. I led a protest in Bern against the Bern Convention because it requires copyright to be too restrictive and to last too long. Copyright should last 10 years from the date of publication of a work. After that, people should be able to do what they like, although a requirement to credit the author might be okay. I have to use servers which I do not control because these servers have computer capability I rely on. Examples include protein folding and an ML something. Well, I suppose the server that's running a protein folding guesser, which may qualify as artificial intelligence, it does a better job than humans do at that one job. Well, you probably have a relationship to that organization, and you're doing work that's connected with that organization. So that's a reason why using the organization's computer to do that work is okay. I hope that it doesn't require you to run any non-free software. Oh, damn. What range of other non-torrent means of software distribution agrees with your principles? As far as I know, GitHub, not GitHub, but the reason is GitHub requires you to run non-free software just to make an account. So GitHub is especially bad. We have criteria for judging repository sites. Look at, I think it's gnu.org/software/ I'll look it up. Yeah, gnu.org/software/repo-criteria.html. That lists how we judge repositories, and repo criteria evaluations.html gives our evaluation of several repository sites and explains why GitHub is so bad. Shouldn't the principles of free software also apply to the hardware itself? Not really. Not today, because we're not in a position to fabricate our own hardware. In fact, fabricating non-trivial hardware is so difficult that you could hardly have the chance of doing it at all, no matter who you are or what you know. Someday that may be possible. If that's possible someday, at that point we will need to demand the development of free hardware designs that we can fabricate or that we can modify and fabricate. So at that point, hardware designs will be an issue pretty similar to software. But that's not the way the world is today. Today, most of us can only get mass-produced hardware. And so the crucial question for us today is, does mass-produced hardware allow us to run free software, and does it avoid malicious functionalities like spying on everyone all the time that would be independent of the software we install? What if I, as a user, decide, fully aware that I want to use non-free software? No one's forcing me to do so. Shouldn't I be free to choose? Well, I'm not trying to prohibit you from running non-free software. But the fact is that these companies that distribute non-free software, they set up pressure for people to run it. And that means that they are to blame. What's your opinion of Telegram? Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about using Telegram, and I don't remember much of what I've learned about it. I believe the client program is free software, so in principle I could use it. Communication requires servers or intermediary nodes one way or another, so it's silly to criticize a given system just because there are servers involved. And there, of course, there are also lots of gateways that the messages have to go through in order for it to be an internet. Maybe I should use Telegram if I can get a free version of it that runs on a free gnu+linux system. I haven't looked into that. I have looked into using Signal, which is used by some people I know. And I think I'd be willing to do that if only it didn't require the user to have a mobile phone number. I don't know what would happen if I gave someone else's mobile phone number to Signal when running it on my computer. Are there plans of the FSF going after bullshit generators found either AI and other AI being trained on GPL license code? No, because everybody should have the right to analyze the way code is written. This idea that looking at a program should violate copyright is twisted. If they can ever do that, we will be terribly screwed. How do you use a free chatbot? Well, I don't know of a free chatbot. There are some that have that. There's some where the code is free. Actually, I do know of some. There are some where the code of the chatbot is free and the model is free, including training inputs. but you can only run it if you have an NVIDIA chip, and the NVIDIA chips are so restrictive that their instruction set is secret. We can't even write a free compiler to compile for NVIDIA GPUs because we don't know what their instruction set is. And not only that, there's non-free software that they need to run, and they don't come with that software pre-installed. You have to install it yourself into the GPU. And I'm not willing to have a non-free program in my computer to even to install into a peripheral. So it's not practical for me to use them. The result of NVIDIA's unjust practices is that millions of computer users are prisoners of the GPU. Some of you might get that. The GPU was run by Stalin. What advice do you have for a person seeking work in software? It seems impossible not to be complicit. Well, there are companies that get paid to do work, and they develop free software for their clients. In fact, one of my friends is part of a cooperative business that develops websites using free software and delivering free software. The clients get the code for what has been built and can then change it or hire others to change it. I don't have recent figures about this, but some years ago, I learned that most of the paid work of software development is done for specific clients. And you can do that kind of work, delivering it as free software. The client's still going to have to pay you or you won't write it. And that's the only ethical way to do that work. Otherwise, you're trying to make your own clients into your prisoners. Comment private. Oh, this is written so small. I'm sorry, I can't read it. How do you think we could fight the evading of privacy in first world countries, especially because of the unequal distribution of power? Well, it's not easy. But the first thing is we've got to be aware of the issue so we can organize. We should be demanding that governments make their websites stop sending non-free software, that they defend and promote systems that respect privacy. One thing you can do is insist on using cache. I do that. And that's why I have this button which says, don't be tracked, pay cash. And in general, when I buy a product, I pay cash. I won't pay in any other way. I won't identify myself. I won't make an account on a store's website because I won't tell the store who I am. I won't use the kind of discount card that identifies who you are because I don't want the store to study me, to manipulate me. And if I want to get something that can only be obtained by ordering it because there are no stores that carry it, well, I have various friends that I know are not willing to reject this practice for themselves and that are happy to order something for me once in a while. So that's what I do, and I pay my friend in cash. There are things that I'm willing to pay for in a way that identifies me. For instance, utility bills. I get a gas bill and an electric bill every month, and they're billed to me in my name because it's my apartment, and I pay them by check. And I have medical insurance, and I pay for that. Well, there's a bank transfer every month. And when I owe some money to a clinic or hospital, I pay that by check or cash, but they know who I am either way. And when I buy prescription medicines, of course I have to tell them who I am, and if necessary, I'll pay by check. Of course, if it's not very expensive, I'll pay cash. And when I pay my taxes, my income tax, of course, that's in my name, so I pay by check. But basically, all the things that could have been anonymous 30 years ago, I still pay anonymously. And that's what I think we should all do. Systematically putting freedom and anonymity in the long term above momentary convenience. And if you don't do that, you're going to suffer for it. What do you think of Rust being used in the kernel Linux? Well, I don't know the Rust language. I've heard people say that it was sort of unstable, they were changing it too often. Technically speaking, it sounds like a bad idea to use a language like that in anything you want for production service. But, it's not my program, I don't work on that, and that's merely a technical opinion. Now, there is a serious problem with the use of Rust, namely the copyright license on the code of the Rust compiler is a free license. It's okay. But there is also a trademark license, and it's not clear what that actually requires people to do if they want to distribute Rust in such a way that it is clearly free software and that others would have the 4 freedoms in using it. Suppose you got a copy of the Rust compiler from us. We would be redistributing it without modification. There are no changes we want to make. We're not Rust users. Why would we change it? But suppose you got it and you wanted to sell copies of some version, perhaps modified. Well, freedoms 1 and 3 include that. You've got to be free to do it. The way we interpret this is that any requirements that you have to do certain things in order to be allowed to sell those copies, they have to be reasonably easy. And the problem is, with the Rust trademark requirements, it's not clear what you'd have to do. You might have to pay a lawyer to work for many days to advise you. And you couldn't afford that, probably, unless you're a big company. This is an obstacle to using Rust. And I asked the Rust Foundation to clarify this for me, and they didn't reply. I wish they would clarify this. If they say what you have to do in a clear way, it might be okay. I hope so. What's the point of reaching a human being in a complaint center if staff often lacks the ability to sympathize? I wasn't looking for sympathy. I was looking for a practical solution. And human staff would have eventually sent me to a manager who would understand the problem that I was faced with and tell me how I could avoid that problem in the future. What browser do you run? I use IceCat, which obviously is a modified version of Firefox. Shouldn't the work put into creating software be appreciated by means of money? Well, if it's a nice thing to do if the developers give you a way to send them money without running non-free software, it's a nice thing to do. But we can't expect you to pay all the developers of all the free programs you're running. That would be too hard. So no, I think that we should contribute to society, and most of the time we shouldn't demand to be paid for doing that. Does free software make sense on non-free hardware? Yeah, it does. Free hardware is not even a coherent concept. It's not the physical object like a computer that can be free or not. There are no copiers for physical objects. The definition of free for software doesn't extend to physical objects naturally. But on the other hand, a design for hardware, that is a work. And so we can talk about whether a design is free. The same four freedoms define that question. So do look at gnu.org/philosophy/free hardware designs. Isn't using non-free software through proxy wrong by transitivity? Well, I don't quite understand the question. What does it mean by proxy? Oh, you mean having someone else do it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Basically, I don't need to refuse to deal with people who run non-free software and activities. There's nothing wrong with my buying from a store that is running non-free software in the cash register. It's not an issue for me. If I'm a true believer in the free software movement, but I fear it isn't enough for a free society. Well, sure, it's not enough. Of course, there are other freedoms that people deserve, which have nothing to do with the software you're running. You need freedom of speech, for instance. You need a government that will respect freedom of speech and freedom to protest. And free software doesn't guarantee that. But it's too much to ask that it do that. How have you read Casey? I can't read that. Industrial Society. Oh, Keynes's Industrial Society and Its Future. No, I haven't. Or Jacques Ellul, The Technological Society. No, I haven't read them. Sorry. What do you think of applications like Signal? As far as I know, Signal is okay. It may be a drawback that there's only one server it could work with. If a server were released free software, others could run such servers. But I can't run Signal because it requires users to have a portable phone number. And I refuse to carry a portable phone because it's an Orwellian tracking and listening device. What about free software for censorship? What about software for I think it's censorship. Well, I don't understand exactly what job would the program be doing? How would it fit into the system who would be running it? I just don't know how to interpret that question. Have there been developments in recent years that surprise you positively? There probably were, but I can't think of them like that. A general category, a question like that, can I think of an example of some very general category that I don't normally think about? I wouldn't remember what is an answer that fits it. But there are not a lot of positive developments these days. Companies are becoming more and more powerful, and they're using that power against us. Isn't running... Okay, a question that begins, isn't our trying to assume something that is unfriendly and demanding I prove it's not true. That's unkind. Isn't running non-free software... Okay, I already answered. Okay, wouldn't it be better, e.g., to cancel an appointment in the UK? No, I don't think it would be. Basically, I don't want, as I see it, giving the UK this information to get permission to go there is tolerable. Running non-free software to give the information is the thing I object to. You should, in your crew, I don't understand this word, open LLM/machine learning projects should be organized in a way that would be in accordance with the moral qualities of computing freedom. Well, we're working on how to define a criterion for free machine learning system, and we're getting pretty close to the end. You expressed disdain for web apps, LLMs, etc. What do you think about self-hosted web apps? I guess that's okay. That's a program installed on your own machine, and somehow you connect to it through a browser. It seems strange to me to want to do things that way, but I don't see anything unjust about it. Do you think it's appropriate for somebody with multiple sexual misconduct accusations to remain such a big figurehead? If you're talking about accusations against me, there's very little truth behind them. What? My what? I have no idea what you're talking about, but there is a site called stallmansupport.org which refutes the accusations. So take a look there, but I'm not going to discuss them here. So you could ask, is it right to hound somebody over misunderstandings, exaggerations, distortions, and starting with an outright misreading of my words that any English speaker can see was a misreading. What do you think about institutes that have nonprofit using non-free software? Basically, it's a bad thing if any organization is using non-free software. The question is, who is it being bad to? And that has to do with who's running that non-free software? Is it asking the public to run non-free software in order to talk with it? Is it just the staff of the organization running non-free software? The magnitude of the harm that's being done depends on that. If a company has, say, 10 employees and they're told to run non-free software, well, that's unfair to them, and it's unfair to the organization too. But that's still not too many people. But if that organization sends non-free software from its website to 1,000 people a day, that's a lot bigger harm, a lot bigger wrong. So that's how I would evaluate the magnitude of that wrong. Is it against your moral principles to ask friends to use non-free software? Well, I think I covered that enough. It is an issue. I would never encourage them to make a practice of using non-free software if they didn't insist on that practice already. As an animal rights activist, I would feel ridiculous if I asked a friend to eat a beef hamburger for me. Well, it's sort of dumb to think of asking a person to eat anything for you. But is free software inherently anti-capitalist? No, I think that free software defends a properly functioning capitalist system, because a crucial aspect of a properly functioning capitalist system is competition. Non-free software tends to lead to monopoly power. You have non-free programs used by sometimes hundreds of millions of people, and there is no real competition to it. There can't be, because of the secrecy involved. Why was the World Wide Web not built around free software? Well, the people involved didn't care about free software. Some of it, the first web servers were free, but the first web browsers were not. It took a while to get a web browser freed, and now we have to fight to keep those going. Is sharing compute resources not necessary? Not for me, at least. You know, I don't need a tremendously powerful machine for most of what I do. On the other hand, yeah, I guess there's so many scenarios that sharing compute resources could refer to that I'm sort of lost at how to respond. I mean, I already responded to a question about protein folding and figuring out how a protein would fold. Some use cases like scientific computing, yeah. Those are very special situations, and there's a lot of other cooperation going on in them. With EU ID, the digital ID developed in the EU as free software, would you oppose a digitalization without analog alternatives in case the government decides to turn proprietary? When if there's going to be a digital ID, it is absolutely necessary to release free software to do whatever jobs people and organizations will be doing with these IDs. You shouldn't have to run non-free software to do anything with your ID that you're supposed to be able to do. And organizations that are supposed to check IDs shouldn't have to run any non-free software to do that. But that's not the only ethical issue that they raise. There are lots of injustices possible with identifying people, just from the fact that people are being identified regardless of how that's done. Of course, computing creates lots of possibilities for identifying and tracking people, and as the example of China demonstrates, that's a quick road to tyranny, to repression. Big tech is currently using, well, things that are mostly free software more than ever. Why are licenses like, I couldn't tell what that is. BSL, I don't know what that is. Not in the interests of the FSF? I don't know what that's referring to. Does anyone know?
It's the business use license that not allowed.
No, I can't imagine. I don't know what in the interests of the FSF. We're campaigning for freedom for you. And a license that isn't free is not in the interests of freedom for people and organizations in general. I'm not sure what the interests of the FSF are, except success in defending freedom for you. For this type of software needed to work society-wide, the country itself would need to reward shared effort and collective benefit instead of private ownership and profit. I don't think that's completely true. I think that there's some changes in the social system ought to be made to make it easier to for people to work together and fund together free software development. The state should insist that whenever it helps to encourage the development of a program or support it, that only be for free software. All such support should be limited to free software so that the results respect the freedom of the citizens. And also, we should, there's a bad thing about this. There are sites that allow people to pool their funds, like Kickstarter and GoFundMe. They all require you to run non-free software to contribute. So because of that, I would never use them. I can't give to them. And I also wouldn't solicit funds through them because that would be asking the public to run the non-free software necessary to give. It's a real shame. Do you have a go-to recipe for convincing non-technical people of free software? The video I showed you is the best way I can do it. That's my best effort. I noticed that they don't care about the four freedoms not much because they don't want to study and modify the source. Well, the reason they should care, which I try to present in that video, is that the software will mistreat them if they don't. Now, people more and more are aware of this mistreatment, but they don't recognize that it's a consequence of non-free software. That's the crucial point to spread. If people can put all these different bad experiences that they have together as a consequence of non-free software, they might realize that what they really need to do is kick the non-free software out of their lives and get rid of it, and then they wouldn't have these bad experiences from so many different programs and online disservices that look like they're all unrelated incidents. Any ideas for how to deal with non-free hardware / software to design it? Well, there are free programs for hardware design, but I'm not an expert on any of them. I don't use any of them. because I don't do that. Well, there's still some questions here. I've answered this much, and there's this much left, but it's 8 o'clock and time to stop. So please look at gnu.org for more information about the GNU project. Please look at fsf.org for more information about the Free Software Foundation. Please look at stallmansupport.org for refutation of personal insults against me.